So welcome back guys. In this lecture video we will try to understand the valid and invalid configuration scenarios for assigning IP addresses. So in this topology you can see that you have an L3 router which have two subnets on its two interfaces. The subnet on the left hand side is 10.1.1.0/24 and the subnet on the right hand side is 11.1.1.0/24. So having understood the IP address mathematics, it must be pretty much clear to you how to calculate the network ID or subnet address. Now you can see that the subnet on the right hand side, that is this subnet, consists of four machines, that is machine A, machine B, machine C and machine D. Right? And you can also confirm that each of these machines are present in the same subnet, and that subnet is 11.1.1.0/24. Right? So everything looks perfect. Now, what if you change the IP address of the machine C to 11.1.2.4/24? What will happen? Is it allowed? So let's see. So if you change the IP address of the machine C to IP address 11.1.2.4/24, then C's network ID will be 11.1.2.0/24, whereas rest of the machine's network ID will be 11.1.1.0/24. So if you change the IP address of the machine C to 11.1.2.4/24, then C will move from the subnet 11.1.0/24 to a new subnet 11.1.2.0/24. So it means if you change the IP address of the machine C, then the machine A, machine B and machine D will be present in one subnet, whereas the machine C will be present in a different subnet. Though all of the machines are physically connected to the same wire. So if you change the IP address of the machine C, as we discussed, C will now be present in a different subnet altogether. So two subnets must always be separated, note the word separated, by L3 router. So remember, L3 router is required to route the traffic from one subnet to another. Since you have changed the IP address configuration of the machine C is present in one subnet, whereas machine A, machine B and machine D are present in different subnet. Right? Now, the subnet of the machine C is not separated by the subnet of the machine A, B and D by L3 router in between. Right? So, emphasizing on this point once again, two subnet must be separated by a L3 router. So if you have a subnet A and you have a subnet B, then you must have an L3 router in between which connects the two subnet. Now in this example, machine C and the machine ABD are not separated by L3 router. So in this example, there is no L3 router present between C and the rest of the machines. So what will happen? C's data cannot be delivered to any of the machine A, B or D or the router itself, because to route the traffic out of C's subnet, L3 router is required. Right? So you can visualize this scenario as two islands, that is subnetwork not connected through C route. So hence this configuration is illegal. So conclusion is that each router's interface is connected to one subnet or another L3 router. Hence each router interface IP mask value must yield unique network ID which identifies the subnet on that interface. Any two machines whose IP and mask value yields the same network ID are said to be present in the same subnet. Right? So Because you have changed the IP address of the machine C, the machine C has now moved from subnet 11.1.1.0/24 to a new subnet which is 11.1.2.0/24. Now, in order to carry out a communication between C and the rest of the machine, after changing the IP address of the machine C, you have to introduce a new L3 router between the machine C and the rest of the machine. Right? If you do this, then only machine C will be able to communicate with the rest of the machines. So you can redesign this topology like this. You have an L3 router, the same L3 router. Then you have a wired connection. You have the machine A, you have the machine B here, and then you have a L3 router here, and to this L3 router machine C is connected, and you have machine D, right? And the machine C's IP address is 11.1.2.4/24, and the IP address on the other end of the router will be 11.1.1. let's say 6/24, right? So you can see that machine A, machine B, and this interface of new router and the machine D now all falls in the same subnet, which is 11.1.1.0/24, whereas the machine C is now being separated from the subnet of machine A, B, and D via new L3 router. So if machine C wants to send the data to machine A, C now depends on L3 routing by L3 router, right? So I hope you understand. If you change the IP address of any machine such that that machine do not belongs to that particular subnet anymore, then that machine has to be separated by a new L3 router in order to facilitate the communication between the machine C and the rest of the machines. So in this example, because you have changed the IP address of the machine C, which causes the machine C to move to a new subnet, you have to introduce a new L3 router to compensate for that. So now going forward, let us discuss another example of invalid configuration of IP addresses. Suppose you have an L3 router, and you can see that in this example, the L3 router has 3 interfaces. Now, if you analyze the IP addresses which are configured on the interfaces of this router, you see that the interface 2 and the interface 3 both are present in the same subnet, which has the network ID 11.1.0/24, right? So going by the principle that different subnets must be separated by an L3 router and same subnet should not be separated by an L3 router. So in this example, you have a subnet 11.1.1.0/24 on this interface, and you have the same subnet which is 11.1.1.0/24 on this interface. So in this example, the same subnet is now separated by an L3 router, right? Because 2 different interfaces of the same router have the same network ID, which is illegal. This is invalid configuration. So conclusion is that we cannot assign IP address or mask value which evaluates to same network ID to multiple interfaces of an L3 router. You should view L3 router as junction of different subnets. In this example, we are trying to use L3 router as junction of same subnet because we have configured different subnets on 2 different interfaces of an L3 router, which is illegal configuration. Every interface of an L3 router must evaluate to a unique network ID. So this is another example of misconfiguration of IP addresses.